Hello, this is Dominica with Easynomics, and we're going to look at another form of trade protection, which is quotas. We're going to use the sugar industry as an example. We can see that the sugar industry provides sugar, obviously, and it's a key input in producing soft drinks, sweets and beverages, convenience foods, fast food, candy, etc. And if quotas, as a result of quotas and other trade protections, increases the price of sugar, which is a key input, it increases the supply curve for these industries because the sugar price has risen. So there are arguments stating that trade protections on sugar actually creates increased unemployment in the soft drink industry, sweets and beverage industry, convenience foods industry, fast food industry, as a result of the higher sugar price compared to the world price. Um, Here we can see that the U.S. sugar system, it just states that it's complicated, that the U.S. government uses price supports such as price floors, forms of quotas, tariff rate quotas, etc., to prop up the price of sugar to protect the domestic sugar producers. And that protection leads to an increase in the sugar price anywhere between 64 to 92% higher than the world price. Um, and here we just have some more information regarding the types of support that the U.S. government provides to its domestic sugar producers. And we're going to take a look at quota as an example. So here we have our domestic sugar market. We can say in the United States. And as we've seen before, we have quantity being measured on the x-axis and price measured on the y-axis. We have an upward sloping supply in the domestic economy labeled SD1, and a downward sloping demand in the domestic economy labeled DD1. And the intersection provides the closed economy equilibrium price at PE and equilibrium quantity at QE. But then the United States opens up to world trade, and then they accept the world price for sugar. So we're going to highlight that that world price is located lower than their domestic production. Thus, the U.S. will be an importer. So this would be price at world, which is equal to the world price for sugar, which is equal to the world supply curve for sugar. Because of that lower world price, and because U.S. domestic producers don't have the comparative advantage because their costs of production are higher, we see an increase in the quantity being demanded by domestic firms that use sugar as a key input, as we saw the fast food industry, the confectionery industry, the sugar beverage industry, etc. So let's illustrate that quantity demanded here. We could say at point B. I'm going to call that Q4, and we'll see why later. And we see the quantity supplied by domestic sugar producers decreases to Q1. All right, we'll say that this is point B, and this is point C. And we can eliminate the equilibrium price. We don't need that for our graph. We're just using that to highlight that the U.S. domestic producers have higher costs of production, and thus the U.S. will be importing sugar as opposed to exporting sugar. All right, so fine. We notice that at the world price, Q4, being the quantity demanded, is greater than the quantity being supplied. Thus, the distance between Q1 and Q4 represents the imports. Okay, so a large quantity of imports coming into this nation. But then the U.S. central government decides to intervene to protect their domestic sugar farmers and producers, and thus they decide to place a quota, okay, to limit imports and increase domestic production. So the best way to do this that I've found in drawing a quota graph is as follows, right? Because this is a little bit difficult to draw. I would look at the space between Q4 and Q3 and try to create 3 equal squares within this area. Okay, so let's say approximately that we have a square here, and the distance between is about the same over here. Okay, so we're going to try to create 3 equal squares, more or less, within this area, and then we can go ahead and label this as Q2 and Q3. Now, let's state that the quota or the amount of imports will be restricted between Q1 and Q2. Okay, so these will be the quota set on a fixed quantity of imports. So imports have been reduced from Q4 minus Q1 to Q2 minus Q1. Only this quantity of sugar imports will be allowed to go into the United States. So what happens? We have domestic production going from 0 to Q1 up to C. Then we have imports from Q1 to Q2 coming into the United States. But then we see from Q4 to Q3, there is a shortage. All right? Again, at the world price, quantity demanded is greater than the quantity being supplied both domestically and with imports. And we know that with a shortage, that puts upward pressure on price. And that will begin to encourage domestic firms to increase output. So what you see happening is domestic firms begin to increase their production. So I'm going to try to draw this more or less parallel. Actually, I'm going to draw it like right about here. All right, you're going to see why in a second. Okay, so we'll label this SD2, which is equal to SD1 plus the quota. All right. So within this shortage, all right, between Q4 and Q2, there's upward pressure on price. Price begins to rise, and as price begins to rise, it encourages domestic producers to continue to produce, and they're going to continue to produce along this second domestic supply curve, right, up to this particular point, and that will establish this quantity being additionally supplied into the economy. Now that also establishes the higher price within the domestic economy. So let's also label that. Perhaps we'll use this color. And let's use a straighter line. Okay. So this will be the price with the quota. I'll call that PQ. Price with the quota, the higher price, incentivizing increased production within that economy. Okay. Now I can continue to draw a few other lines to finish this up. So I'm going to draw a line here. All right, and I'm pretty much finishing this A, B, C, and I can label some other points maybe to help me with my analysis. See, or I can also say point E going up to point F. All right, so I have fully drawn a quota, and now I can label some areas to highlight the impact on stakeholders. So I'll label this area A. Here's area B, lowercase b, lowercase a, C, area D, E, maybe I'll call it 1, and E2, area F, and area G. Okay, and now I've finished drawing my quota. So let me go ahead and analyze this as I would for a paper exam. As can be seen, we have a graph A, for the domestic sugar industry in the United States. We're measuring quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis. We have a downward sloping domestic demand curve labeled D1. Demand perhaps coming from the fast food industry, the confectionery industry, demanding sugar as a key input for their production. And we have an upward sloping domestic supply curve labeled SD1, where SD1 equals DD1 at point A. It provides an equilibrium price and quantity in this closed economy. But this national economy opens up to world trade, and they accept the world price at PW, which sets a perfectly elastic world supply curve. At PW, the quantity demanded increases to point B, or Q4, and the quantity domestically supplied decreases to Q1, as many of these sugar producers are productively inefficient compared to other foreign exporters. Right? At point C, Q1. Since at price at world, Q4 is greater than Q1, or the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, that provides excess demand or a shortage. And that shortage is satisfied by imports. So imports before the quota come in the amount from Q4 to minus Q1. All right, these are imports before the quota. Okay. All right. So then the central government decides to intervene. They want to encourage more domestic production of sugar, and they decide to apply a quota. A limited amount or a fixed amount of sugar that will be tolerated to be imported into this domestic economy. And they set that quota in the amount of Q2 minus Q1. So only this quantity of sugar can be imported into the domestic economy. Thus, we have a quantity domestically supplied from 0 to Q1 along our SD curve. Then we have imports coming in the amount from Q1 to Q2. And that creates a shortage because at that world price, quantity demanded at Q4 is greater than the quantity supplied at Q2. A shortage puts upward pressure on price, and price begins to rise from PW to P price at quota, PQ. That higher price incentivizes domestic firms to continue to produce. And that will be seen along our SD2 curve, our supply of the domestic economy 2, which is equal to SD1 plus the quota. So continued domestic production continues from point E to point F, or from Q2 to Q3. And at that higher price, there's a reduction in the quantity demanded along the demand curve from point B to point F, or from Q4 to Q3. So we can kind of imagine the domestic supply curve looking something like this. Let's see if I can find a good color. So the domestic supply curve is kind of holding this shape. It's moving up along its domestic production, then it flattens out here because these are the imports, and then it continues along here. All right, so it's kind of this shape right here, if you can see that. All right, so that is the analysis. Now let's evaluate the impact on different stakeholders. All right, let's take a look at number one. How does this impact consumers of sugar? Consumers, right? That being other firms that are demanding sugar as a key input for their production of soft drinks, confectionaries, etc. This negatively impacts consumers because the price has risen from PW to price at quota, right? And it reduces their consumer surplus because before the quota, it was equal to areas A plus B plus C plus D plus E1 plus E2 plus F. And then consumer surplus after the quota has now been reduced to areas A plus B. So there's a dramatic decrease in the consumer surplus. Originally, it was this triangular area, and now it's been reduced to this triangular area. Okay? And that can potentially generate increased unemployment in those industries since they're paying a higher price for the key input of sugar. All right, reduce quantity supplied of fast food, reduce quantity supplied of soft drinks, and so on. Great. So let's move on to producers, domestic producers. Number two, domestic producers of sugar. They benefit from the quota because they are protected. They are better off because their producer surplus before the quota was equal to area G. And then the producer surplus after the quota is equal to areas G plus C, we can say. It's equal to areas G plus C. Another way of visualizing this, there's two ways, but that's probably the easiest way. We can visualize this as this triangular area, or we can also visualize this. I can go ahead and label an additional area. I can go and label, oops, sorry. This area, and I can state this is D1 and D2 potentially. So I can say that it's equal to GC, as I said before, but since I've changed the labeling, I will alter this and state that it is equal to G plus C plus D1, G plus C plus D1, which should also be equal to G plus C plus E1. Okay, so let's see if you can see what I'm drawing here. So here we have the increased producer surplus, and I can either say that it also includes area D1, or instead I can say it includes area E1, which in theory, if these are equally spaced, are the same. I hope that is clear. So G plus C plus D1 also being equal to G plus C plus E1. Either way is fine for me to state it if I labeled everything as you see here. Okay? Great. So producer surplus has been increased. And also we can talk about total revenue. Total revenue before the quota was equal to PW times Q1, and then total revenue with the quotas is equal to price at quota times, I could say Q2, just for the sake of simplicity, since I'm saying this producer surplus is equal to the same of GC plus E. Let's just keep it simple. Total revenue has increased as a result of the higher price. So producers are clearly better off. And we can also mention three, workers within the sugar industry also benefit because since sugar producers are increasing their quantity supplied, going from 0 to Q1, quantity supplied from 0 to Q1, and then it continues from Q2 to Q3, I can say there's more supply, thus firms in the sugar industry can employ more factory production such as workers. Great. What about the government? Let's take a look at the government. All right. Next point, looking at the government. They do not gain any revenue. They don't have to spend any money, but the government may incur some tension with exporting nations that are exporting less to the United States because of the quota. So that can create tension within the World Trade Organization between nations and so forth. So in the global trade arena, this national government that's imposing quotas may face some tense relationships with other governments that want to export more to the US but are unable to due to the quota. Okay. How about foreign nations or foreign producers? Foreign producers or exporting nations, right? They are negatively impacted because they're going to be exporting less. Their quantity supplied is falling because no longer can they export an amount that was from Q4 to Q1. They're now restricted to exporting amount from Q2 up some Q4 to Q1. Now they're exporting amount from Q2 to Q1. Thus, foreign producers experience less exports. Total revenue falls for them. They will have to unemploy or fire resources such as labor, etc. Again, and they will pressure their governments to pressure the US, in this case, this domestic economy, to repeal those quotas. Okay. How about the global allocation of resources? Global allocative efficiency is negatively impacted. Okay, global allocative efficiency negatively impacted because we have a reduction in the quantity supplied. And we can state that at Q3, that the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. Thus, there's an under allocation of resources to the production and consumption of sugar. If the quota was repealed, we'd see an increase in quantity demanded, and at point B, or at Q4, marginal benefit in the global economy would equal the marginal cost. But the quota restricts quantity demanded to Q3, and at Q3, in the global economy, marginal benefits greater than marginal cost, under allocations allocatively efficient. So that means that there's a welfare loss. And we can state that for this domestic economy, the welfare loss is equal to areas D2 and F, right? It's equal to, in this case, D2, which we see here, and F. And we can also state that it's also equal to the areas of E1 plus E2. So the welfare loss is essentially this area here. Okay. F, as we've seen before, represents the reduced consumption, where at Q3, where at Q3 marginal benefit equals is greater than marginal cost. So we've lost that consumption. Area D represents the increased output by an inefficient sugar producer, which we've seen when we talked about tariffs and production subsidies. And area E is equal to revenue generated by the exporting nation that are exporting at a higher price as a result of the shortage at PQ. So this is additional revenue that's really going out of this country to the exporting nation. So E1 and E2 also equal to D1 and D2, representing that revenue. All right, I will provide a full analysis outline and evaluation in the information section of this video. It's a slightly more complicated graph to draw, analyze, and evaluate, but I provide those notes in the information section below. And that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to comment, and don't forget to subscribe and to like. Thank you so much.